I'm excited for you to be here. I'm going to invite you to open up your Bible to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4. If you were here yesterday morning, you remember that we started talking about God's kingdom being a kingdom of peace. And whenever God's kingdom breaks into a chaotic world, the result for the individual is always peace. There's no question about that. He is the Prince of Peace that brings that peace that passes all understanding. And so we started looking at that at the end of chapter 4. It was that scene when the disciples are with Jesus in a boat in the dark and a storm comes along and Jesus speaks into the darkness and chaos has to flee. Mark has a particular writing style, though. I want to continue on with that tonight. And the thing that about Mark, I love Mark's gospel. Do you all have your favorite book of the Bible? There are just certain books that you feel like you belong in. And I spend a lot of time with Mark, and I feel like I've gotten to know him just a little bit over the years. And when you get to know somebody, you begin to notice some things about him. You've been married to him for a while, right, sister? You've been married to that thing for a while, so anyhow, you begin to learn some things about that kind of thing. And so Mark has a particular way of writing. What he will do is he'll present an aspect of the kingdom, Jesus will. And then after he presents that aspect of the kingdom, you'll begin to see it played out before our eyes in the lives of the disciples and in the lives of others. Now, I don't expect you to remember, but a number of years back, I preached from Mark chapter 8 and 9 from a section that I referred to as the nature of the kingdom. It begins with Jesus looking at his disciples, men that he've traveled with for over 3 years now. He looks at them and he says, "How is it, guys, you have eyes and yet you don't see? You have ears and yet you don't hear. Why aren't you getting this?" So he confronts them with the reality of kingdom vision, and then the next thing we run into is a blind man. Do you remember that story? It's that story where Jesus spits in that guy's eyes. Y'all do know that's weird, right? Really good people on Monday night, you're so familiar with that story, you think, well, that's just normal. No, it's not. You go to Lens Crafters, they're not going to spit in your eye. If they do, you better go down to Pearl Vision. If they do it there, you can try Walmart, but there's no promises at Walmart. But anyway, we see that guy there, and then the section ends at the end of chapter 10 with a blind guy. It's Bartimaeus. "I want to see." And Jesus says, "Okay, see." Why does that matter? Because these are the bookends of the section. We're going to see what the kingdom's purpose is in our lives. Jesus meets us at our point of darkness. He always comes to us in our blindness, but he refuses to leave us there. He wants to bring us more and more into the full light of the kingdom. He wants to have us to have kingdom vision here and now. But if you're going to have kingdom vision, you have to meet the kingdom requirement. In order to meet the kingdom requirement, you have to have the kingdom mindset. See, that's the end of chapter 8. It's the beginning of chapter 9. When you have the kingdom mindset, you can begin to operate in kingdom power. That's the end of chapter 9, and on and on and on. It's the way Mark writes. And so in order to appreciate the kingdom of peace and how that kingdom spreads, we see it start at the end of chapter 4. And it'll go all the way through to the end of chapter 6. Because you know what we run into at the end of chapter 6? Another storm. It's really interesting. In over 3 years of Jesus' earthly ministry, there are only 2 storms that are recorded. Physical storms. And both of them occur in the darkness while the disciples are in a boat on the sea. The only difference in the chapter 6 is Jesus isn't snoring in the stern. But see, all between these 2 bookends, we begin to see how peace spreads in individuals' lives and even how it can be rejected. But in order for us to understand the aspect of the kingdom, we have to go back to the beginning of chapter 4, because this is where Jesus begins to present it. So what we're going to look at tonight is verses 1 through 9. And I hesitate on this. I really do, because I knew you would be here. I do believe that really good people come to church on Monday night. And so you've grown up in Sunday school. You've grown up in Vacation Bible School. And if I had to say that there was one parable that was the most familiar, it would probably be this one. I don't know if you'd agree or not. It's the parable of the soils, or the parable of the sower. We learn about it as children. We sit in Sunday school classes. We hear sermons. I think we're friends. Most of us are. And the ones that aren't, I don't care. But anyhow, I'm going to have a good time whether you do or not. Maybe I'm feeling a little bit feisty too. But anyhow, when I look at Scripture, there are certain passages that I stay away from. Not because they're not important, but because I feel like when you mention that passage, people will think, oh, I know it all. You know what I'm talking about? And I begin to ask myself the question, what could I possibly share that hadn't been shared? As if there's anything new under the sun. There's nothing new. And so tonight, I'm going to step out, and even though you know everything about this parable, I want us to spend some time with it together. And my prayer is that the Lord will bring us through His Spirit to the place that He intends for us to be. So we're going to read verses 1 through 9. Now the explanation goes verses 10 through 20. We're not going to read that, but I will reference different verses. Mark chapter 4, verse 1. And again, Jesus began to teach by the sea. And a great multitude was gathered to him, so that he got into a boat, and he sat in it on the sea. And the whole multitude was on the land facing the sea. Then he taught them many things by parables, and said to them in his teaching, listen, pay attention. Behold, a sower went out to sow. And it happened, as he sowed, that some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds of the air came and devoured it. Some fell on stony ground where it did not have much earth, and immediately it sprang up because it didn't have any depth of earth. But when the sun was up, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away. And some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no crop. But other seed fell on good ground, and yielded a crop that sprang up, increased, and produced, some 30-fold, some 60, and some 100. And Jesus said to them, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now you'll remember that Jesus has been about his Father's business. He's been out in the crowd, and because he's been proclaiming his Father's kingdom, lives have been changed. You could say for different individuals during this 2-year period of time that peace had overtaken the chaos that they had been living in. And we notice all throughout those 2 years that that's what he has been doing. Through the preaching of his Father's kingdom, lives have been changed as individuals have been encountered. But today we notice that he begins to do something a little bit different. I mentioned to you yesterday morning that just when you think you know Jesus, he goes and he does something wrong. See, I knew you wouldn't like it because you didn't like it yesterday. I'll change it again. Just when you think you know Jesus, he goes and he does something unexpected. That's better, right? I mean, come on, if something doesn't go your way, you think it's wrong. That's all I mean by that. I mean, he's been teaching now for 2 years, but today, as the crowds have gathered so great in number that Jesus and the disciples got into a boat on the lake, and Jesus begins to teach, for the first time in over 2 years, he begins to teach the crowds in parables. This is the first time that he's done it. It's so interesting to me because in my mind, in my what would you call it? I want to say dumbness, my ignorance, I guess would be the way to state it. I always thought that's the way he started from the beginning. But it wasn't until well into his second year that he does this. And you know, because you're really good people, that we often define a parable, I said it yesterday morning, as an earthly story filled with heavenly truth. And that is true, but you realize it's so much more than that. We like to take what the preacher has said, and we like to take what the Sunday school teacher has said, and mom and dad and mama and papa, and just think, well, that's settled, that's all it is. But you understand that Jesus never defined a parable as such. That wasn't his purpose. It was Aristotle that defined it like that. In fact, when you come to Mark's gospel, a parable seems to be so much more than that. It seems as though Jesus has the desire to shake up the people. He wants to shake them from the status quo. Isn't it interesting how so many of us settle for mediocre? We settle for the status quo. And Jesus wanted to confront the mediocrity of the day. So what he would do is he would take common things and use them in uncommon ways. And because of that, it could be unsettling and sometimes come across even disturbing, because it was seemingly ominous at some point, and it would even shock. And that's the point that Jesus is using here. Because Jesus, by the usage of parable, wanted to alert. It's what I said yesterday morning. And by the way, if Peter and Paul could repeat themselves, we preachers can too. Because, as Peter says in 2 Peter, I want you to remember. When I'm not here, I want you to remember. I pray that you will always remember. And so that's why we repeat ourselves. I don't know if you do or not, but I'm including you in this because most preachers do. But anyhow, we see that he wants to alert the crowds to the new thing that God was doing right there in their midst. And I want you to understand, he's the one they were looking for. He's the one that the scriptures had foretold, that the prophets talked about, that the law pointed to. And yet they were so caught up in their religiosity that they did not see him. And so we see that Jesus wanted to grab their attention and let them know that something new was happening right then, right now, and he wanted them to get on in on that. And because of that, the desire of the parable would be to reverse the hearer's expectations. It would be to change their values as it would confront the social standards and the roles in society in that day. Long of it and short of it, however you want to say it, ultimately a parable was meant to cause the hearer to think. It's meant to cause us to think. You all do realize it doesn't hurt God's people to think every now and then. I've found that we've come to the place where we like to be spoon-fed. We like to just kind of lap the milk out of the spoon as someone holds it before us, or just drink it through the straw. And there comes a time that we need to move on to solid food. We need to get into the meat. And that's what the desire of the parable is, to cause us to think. It will jolt our perceptions. It will call us to response. And through that response, we'll not simply be enlightened, but we will be changed. How many of you are ready for a change in your life? How many of you know you need to move from where you are to something more? That's what Jesus longs to do, and the effectiveness of a parable will be judged by how well it produces that response. The desired result will show us whether or not it worked. It's a call to respond in our attitudes, in our will, and in our actions. That's why Jesus says, if you've got ears, and I like in the translation that will say, if you've got two good ears, but I'm going to suggest something, not that translators are wrong, but I'm going to say, if you've got one bad ear, you need to listen. We need to hear. But the difference here is when Jesus says it, it calls for active participation. It's something we lose in our Western thought process. It's tied to the Hebrew thought of active listening. The third person imperative really stresses that. It's not only to hear, not only to learn from the teacher, But then after you hear it, you observe what you learned. How do you observe it? By doing what's been taught. And through that, a difference is made. So Jesus begins to speak in parables. I need to move on, and I will. But you need to know this as well, because sometimes we like to say we're living in the most fallen time in history. But what you need to know is this. The world in this hour where we see Jesus in the boat was just as fallen then as it is now. Man's condition has not changed. The evil in man's heart has not changed. The difference between then and now is now everything we want is at our fingertips. I remember when I was a boy, you had to work at being bad. But now it's all right there. And we've got a 24-hour news cycle. I mentioned it. If you don't like this one, turn over to this network. I mean, it's constantly before our eyes. We see all the things. I mean, there's a gun that goes off somewhere, and all of a sudden, everybody around the world knows. Why? Because it's always in our face. But you need to know that the world was largely unreceptive and just as evil in the day that Jesus spoke this parable. You say, well, Billy, but the crowds were there. Yeah, they were. But remember, why were they there? They were getting caught up in the activity. It started happening at the end of chapter 1 when Jesus cured that leper and told him not to say anything, and he blabbed it to everybody. At that point, he couldn't openly enter anywhere. Why? Because the crowds would mob him, because they wanted to see the show. And the thing is, if you simply get caught up in activity and you miss him, you'll have missed it all. Because it's not about what he's doing, it's about who he is and what he's come to accomplish in our lives. So they are missing him, and he begins to teach by saying, listen, a sower went forth to sow. And there are those common elements. Everybody there that day would understand what Jesus was talking about. I dare say, now maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but I think it's true. Everybody here tonight understands a sower, a seed, and soil. Those are the elements that Jesus is using. And he begins to paint this picture of a sower that goes out and scatters this seed. And he begins to describe the different types of land or soil that the seed falls on. The first group is the hardened path, or as my translation said, the wayside in verse 4. Some seed fell upon the wayside, verse 4, and the explanation is verse 15. And when you think about a hardened path, I don't know what happens in your mind, but my mind automatically goes back to the time when I was a boy. Because when I was a boy, we had Great Danes. I told you I like dogs, probably because I've always had dogs. But you know, do you understand what a Great Dane is? If you don't, they're little ponies that are canine. Nothing little about them. We had a 6-foot pen in the back, and this is not an exaggeration. They could put their paws over the top of that fence and their head would lean over. I mean, they were big dogs, gentle giants. But because they would spend time in that pen, they got to where they wanted to run right along the fence. You know how dogs are. They wanted to run along. They wanted to be near you. If you were out in the yard, that's what they would be doing. They'd be running along. And wherever they would run along that fence, they began to beat that ground to death. Eventually, that path that they ran on became so bare because they had pounded it down so much that nothing is going to grow out of there. It has become the hardened path. Well, some of you aren't dog people. I know you're more of cat people, and they've got a tender touch, but they just go to the bathroom everywhere they ought not. But anyhow, you know, so let me change the illustration of the hardened path. All of us have gone to a place of business before, an office building or a doctor's office, a hospital, or perhaps a store, something like that. And you know, when they build something like that, they try to keep the aesthetics in their mind. They want to make it appealing. So instead of just having a concrete jungle, you know, they've got the parking lot that they'll make. They'll have the different parking spaces. But they'll also at times put little islands out there in the parking lot. You've seen that before, right? They'll make an island there, kind of an oasis in the middle of the concrete jungle. They'll put some trees, some pretty sod, some grass down there, maybe some mulch. It's that time of year, and some flowers, all that kind of thing. They want to pretty it up. And see, inevitably, they'll come to that lot and they'll park their car and they'll see the front door up there, how to go in. And you know, instead of walking around those islands, they'll think, well, this must be a shortcut. Going to save so much time and effort. They just begin to walk right across the middle of that island, right through that grass, and they start something because now somebody else is going to come and park behind them. And when they see that someone has walked through that island, they're going to think, well, that must be a shortcut. And they want to take the shortcut too. So what do? They begin to walk through. And pretty soon, everybody walks that same path. And now the beautiful oasis that was meant to break up the concrete jungle, it's hardened and ugly. Why? Because nothing will grow there because it's been walked on, it's been pressed down so hard. That's the hardened path. You've all walked on one, and this is the first soil that the seed falls upon. And you know, because you're really good people, that the soil is a picture of individuals. And when we see the wayside or the hardened path, this pictures for us hardened, unreceptive people. You do realize that there are some people that have been walked on so much, it's hard to get anything to grow. You do know that some people have been hardened by life to the point that it just seems like nothing. They're stone. Nothing is going to happen. And so that's the picture that we have. And yet, it's interesting because we see that as the seed is there. Now remember, Mark is our first gospel account. It's second in our New Testament, but it's the one with the earliest dating. It's the first written gospel. It's actually believed that Matthew and Luke used Mark in another source and they wrote their gospel accounts. That's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar. The synoptic gospels, you find many of the same stories throughout. And so this particular parable is there. Mark will say that as the seed lays there on the wayside or the hardened path, that Satan comes and robs it. Matthew in chapter 13, verse 19 says that the evil one comes and steals the seed. And then Luke in chapter 8, verse 12, very plainly says that the devil snatches the seed. Now, why would I point that out to you? Because I want you to be very sure that the enemy knows the power of the seed. That's right. I want you to see that. Yeah. The enemy knows that the seed, even upon the hardest ground, even upon the hardest heart, if it's allowed to stay there, then it will have the ability of breaking through. So the enemy steals that possibility away. He robs any hope of life because he knows the power of the seed. Some seed fell by the wayside. Now the second category, as the sower goes and sows, is some seed falls on stony ground. It's verse 5, or rocky soil. The explanation is verses 16 and 17. And you know what this is. I mean, if you've ever tried to begin a flower bed or some kind of garden, you usually have to break up the hardness of that top layer. You have to break up. If you're going to go into that island that was planted in the concrete jungle and do it all over again, you've got to get that ground, that hardness broken up. And we see that this is an image of broken up ground, but the problem is the hardness has been broken, but it hasn't been removed. There are still stones there, and especially if you go down deeper, it's just kind of surface level. It's broken up, but there's still hard down beneath. So if you plant seed there, you know that the roots are only going to go down a particular distance, and because it can't go to where it needs to be for the nourishment to sustain life, when the sun comes out, the sun scorches that tender plant, and the life that has started is gone. Now, you know, really good people, that this pictures shallow reception of the gospel. And we've known people like this. We do. There are individuals that get turned on for Jesus for a moment. I mean, they get excited. They'll come to a meeting like this. They'll have something going on, and they'll just get stirred up, and they'll get there. But it never goes beyond, you know. You never take the time to really dig down and do the work that needs to be done. And because life isn't easy, did I just ruin somebody's day? Did you do realize that life isn't easy, right? If there's somebody here that has always had an easy life, I don't mean to break it to you, but you better get ready because hard times are going to come. I'll encourage you on a Monday night, won't I? I mean, the preacher says hard times are coming. Yeah, because they are. Life isn't easy, and let's be real, life isn't even always fun. I don't like cliche, but it's the truth. God, though, is always good. Aren't you thankful for that? But see, if you've never taken the time to get deeper, then when the heat is on, when the sun comes out, it will rob the life that has been begun because there is no structure, there is no root source there that can stay, fulfill the nourishment. And you, just like that tender plant, will wither away. We've all seen it. That's the second category. You got the wayside, you've got the rocky or the stony ground. And then we see, as he's scattering, some falls among thorns. Verse 7, verses 18 and 19. Now, I am not a green thumb. I know there are some people that enjoy their flowers. I'm not a person that can do that. In fact, if there's such thing as a black thumb or a brown thumb, that's me. If you notice, I'm staying away from these fake flowers because if I touch them, I'm not going to, but if I touch them, you'll come back tomorrow and they will be withered. It's just the effect that I have. You know, all that sort of thing. But my dad used to enjoy planting things like tomato plants. Every year he'd have to put out tomato plants because I guess he felt like he needed to keep the community in tomatoes. I don't know why one person needs to grow, but I mean everywhere I go, these people that plant tomato plants, you bring all these tomatoes to give around, and I wish he had some, I'd take some home. But anyhow, you know, he would plant some. And when he would go back, there was a particular area in our backyard along the fence that he would break up. He would remove the stones. He would also pull out everything else that was growing there. He would pull out the weeds because you realize if you plant something among something else, the one that's more established is usually the one that will live. It will choke out the life of that new growth that you're trying to accomplish. My dad was such a hillbilly, and I can say that they're my family. My family's Appalachian. We come from southeast Kentucky, northeast Tennessee. And they were only in Cincinnati for work. I've told you that before. And Dad, this is how hillbilly he was. He would take those half barrels, you know what I'm talking about, like a barrel cut in two. A lot of people will use them like as planters and plant pretty flowers and all that kind of thing. Right there in the city, Dad would point those on the porch posts, those half barrels in there. And you know what he would grow out of them? He'd grow watermelon. That's embarrassing for a young boy. You guys don't care, but it embarrassed me. But anyhow, you know, if you don't pull out the other things, it will rob the life that has grown there. And this is the most common. Well, let me put it like this. Think about if this is your church, even if it's not. Many of you have been in this church many times and known people that have been here. You can think about the people that have sat in these pews before over the years. And there are some people, man, if something was going on, they were going to be there. If there was a prayer service, they're there. If there's a revival, they're there. If there's a sing, they're there. I mean, anything that was going on, they were there. But now, years have passed and the seat is empty. And it's not because they've gone on to glory, and we know that some have, but not all of them. Some of them now, they just make different choices. I mean, this is the most familiar. I meet people like that every week. Billy, I won't be there on Tuesday. And I don't care. I mean, I'm people tell me that. I don't mind. They come and tell, but the problem is they go on to tell me why they won't be there on Tuesday. I won't be there on Tuesday. I got a bowl. I'm on a bowling league. You know, it's one of those things. If you think that the place will fall in if you don't show up one Tuesday night to bowl, I promise you, if you do show up, the pins probably aren't falling. But I mean, if you feel like, boy, you all are serious tonight, aren't you? Are there bowlers around here or what? Let me just put it like this. Billy, are you saying there's something wrong with bowling? No. Of course I'm not. But when you have an opportunity, a rare opportunity, doesn't happen all the time, an opportunity to be with God's people in His presence and grow in Him, I'll borrow from another parable. I'll tell you that's not very wise. In fact, I would say that's pretty foolish. And I'd caution you not to waste the precious oil of the Holy Spirit. That's right. Won't be there on Tuesday. Got to watch Dancing with the Stars. Someone actually said that to me. I don't even know what night Dancing with the Stars is on. But you know, I don't understand that in the first place. I guess I can understand bowling more than that. I mean, if you want to watch people who are has-beens put on tights and twirl around a dance floor, that doesn't make one bit of sense to me. It doesn't. And if you want to watch it, you do know today there is this thing called DVR, or television on demand. If you don't know how to operate it, trust me, find a 3-year-old, they'll set it up for you. Well, Billy, are you saying there's something wrong with Dancing with the Stars? I might be saying that. I mean, that's up to you. But I will say, whatever it would be, whatever you choose to watch, when you put that over an opportunity of gathering with God's people in God's presence, a rare opportunity, when you just kind of waste that time away in order to watch, I'll tell you, that's not very wise. It's pretty foolish. And I'd suggest don't waste the oil. Well, my kid's got to play ball on Sunday. Shame on you, Mom, Dad. Your kids are going to face their maker one day. They do have to do that. They're not going to impress him with stats. I'm not trying to be ugly. I'm trying to tell you there's a lot of thorny people. Or let me put it in language that many will understand. This is a picture of the unsanctified heart. Yeah. That's right. Crowded with other things. And eventually, what was there before will take precedence. And it will choke out the life that has started. Yeah. Some fell among thorns. And then finally, we see in verse 8, explanation verse 20, that some of the seed fell amongst good soil. And we know that this is the cultivated soil, where the hardness has been broken up, where the stones and the thorns have been removed. And because it's cultivated, because it's ready, it produces a crop of real and lasting fruit. We're not talking about fruits of the Spirit. We're talking about an actual harvest where the sickle is taken to it. Some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. Because the heart was cultivated, it was prepared, but it was also producing. Good soil is prepared and producing. Some seed fell amongst good soil, the cultivated soil. So let me ask you, since we're all familiar with this parable, the thing that began to happen in my mind, I've confessed I'm analytical. I began to wonder, what is it that we need to see when Jesus speaks these words? What is it about this parable that we need to get a hold of in 2023 to be the men and women that he intends for us to be in order for the kingdom of peace to advance, to overtake? Do we need to simply look at the soil? And can we confess that's usually our focus? We like to look at the soil because we want to say, gotta be good soil. In fact, I see some people sitting there sometimes, they act as though, I'm good soil, I'm prepared. And by all means, let me tell you, be good soil. But also, remember, if you are good soil, you don't have to tell anybody. In fact, no matter what soil you are, the soil reveals itself. Well, what do you mean? Good soil is not only prepared, it's producing. Not spiritual fruit, producing a crop. That's the whole point. See, this is what I'm tired of. Well, we hired the pastor to come in here and grow the church. I'm sick of that. Me too, bro. Gonna get this music in here. Get a youth pastor, straighten my kids out. Well, maybe if you'd be mom or dad. That's right. Amen. Do you know how perverted that mindset is? And that's what's overtaken the churches. Hire a pastor to grow the church. It's the dumbest thing. Because you do remember that a pastor is a shepherd. You do recall that, right? He is actually the under shepherd to the shepherd. And what does a shepherd do? Shepherd feeds, protects, guides. Sheep produce sheep. So, if your church is growing, think twice before you point at him or whoever's on staff around here. Look in the mirror and remember the last time you produced life. Because if the sheep aren't reproducing, then there's not going to be a flock. That's right. Amen. Hey, I'm preaching good whether you like it or not. I'm just tired of beating up good, godly men and women because you're too lazy to take the commission that God has put on your life seriously. You blame everybody and everything when you are the reason. Not you, everywhere else I preach to. Good soil is prepared and producing. The soil reveals itself. So if you're a good soil, everybody will know. Why? Because you'll be producing a crop. So we've got to pay attention to the soil. How about the seed? Well, by all means, you've got to consider the seed. Why? Because in Mark's gospel, you remember that Jesus says the seed is the word of God. The seed is the word. What's exciting about that is, remember, John will say, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God, and the word became flesh. So when Jesus is speaking of the word, he is speaking of himself. And the seed is the word of God. By all means, we cannot overlook the importance of the seed. But here's the powerful thing in this particular parable. It's the same seed throughout. The same seed falls on the soil in verses 4, 5, 7, and 8, and only a fourth of it takes root. Only a fourth produces a crop that's lasting. That's an overwhelming thought. I don't think it can be understood mathematically, but I couldn't get away from it. Think about it. 25% of the soil that is mentioned, 25%, the seed does its work. A crop is produced. Well, Billy, being silly now. You're taking it too. Am I? Because Jesus said, the path that leads to destruction is wide. Narrow's the gate, narrow's the way. Few will find it. And then in Matthew chapter 7, hey, we were really good people on Monday night. Pastor said we were cream of the crop. We get money, we did this, we did all that. We listened to a bald guy stop, snort, and spit. And Jesus will look at them and say, who are you? %. See, that's why we didn't get some people back from COVID. Because we never had them in the first place. I mean, that's the truth. And we want to say, well, and I'm thankful for modern technology. I'm home and watch it. I guess if you'd rather stay home and fold underwear while you listen to a sermon. It's amazing. I mean, you can go to the restaurant, go down to the store, but no, got to stay home. Can't come to church. Well, you never really in the first place, were you? Oh, but I don't like that. 20, you're seeing why I'm not a pastor. 25%. Think about that. 25% of the people, the span of your ministry, maybe a fourth of them get it. Can't overlook the seed. Can't. In fact, our problem is we like to separate them out. We like to focus on one or another. And what I'm learning when I spend time in this parable, that you can't overlook either one, because what matters in this parable is the interaction with the soil. What really matters in this parable is the merging of the soil and the seed. They have to come together. It's because when the seed interacts with cultivated soil, a crop is produced. The merger matters. This is the source of life. The first three, nothing. But when it comes together with God, life begins, growth happens, and a crop is produced. The merger of the two is the point. So let me ask you this, and I'll wrap it up real quick. But let me ask you this. And I feel really weird asking really good people on a Monday night, but I've got to. Have you allowed that to happen in your life? I believe we've all been each sort. Have allowed that interaction to take place? And if not, will you? Will you allow the seed to produce life in you? A life through you that only comes from Him. The soil reveals itself. Let me take it a little bit further. I'm going to take it. You're really good people on Monday night, so we're going to just go a bit deeper. I want you to think about this. If that's happening in you and me, everybody's going to know. Why? Because we're going to produce a crop. I've said it 3 times now. It's the production of the crop through the merge. So if Jesus the seed is living through you, if the life that's being produced from the seed is the very life of, don't you know your life is not your own? If you live with a sanctified heart, it's Him living His life through you, and the way that you will produce a crop, the only way a crop will be produced is if you begin to scatter the seed. That's what Jesus did. Jesus is the Word. And if He is living through you, you will scatter seed as well. It's a really interesting picture. Because when I think about this parable, I'm not a farmer. I've told you, I grew up in the city. Dad had watermelon plants on the porch. I'm not a farmer. The weekends through my 8th grade year, we went down just outside Williamsburg, Kentucky, a little stretch on 92 called Yaden. There wasn't any farms down there. I mean, we hung tobacco every now and then. I didn't grow up in a Nazarene home. I mean, they ran shine. They didn't make it. They bootlegged it. Just talking with somebody like that. Oh, judge me if you want. People got to make a living. I'm kidding. Some of you really need to loosen up. I mean, I'm not kidding about them bootlegging, and I'm not trying to excuse it. But anyhow, you know, I don't know anything about farming. When I went to school at Olivet, just south of Chicago, and it's in the middle of some farmland. Where this is, I mean, a whole lot of corn. I lived in Northwest Indiana after school. I was a youth pastor. There was a lot of corn and soybeans. They say there's more than corn in Indiana, but I haven't found it yet. But anyhow, you know, I've traveled enough now that I've watched different farmers. I've even seen places who have left different fields empty for 2 or 3 years, getting it ready to plant a particular crop in it. I mean, I've learned a little bit something. And when I look at this particular guy, a sower went forth to sow, and some seed fell here and there. I've got to say it, he's a horrible farmer. He is. Because even I know you don't waste seed. Seed is precious. It's costly. You don't wait. You put seed in prepared soil. But he throws it everywhere. But then I realize, you know, if someone has already paid for the seed. Oh, see, some of you need to think just a little bit. If the price for the seed has been paid, if there's an unlimited supply, then we can afford to be generous. But see, what we would rather do in the church, we would rather judge soil than scatter seed. Look at him, all those tattoos. Not wasting my seed there. Look at that lifestyle that person's living in. Not. We would rather judge soil than scatter seed. And the thing that I see in the parable, it's not your job to judge the soil. It's your job to scatter the seed. The problem is this. The enemy knows the power of the seed, but I don't think we do. Because if we truly believed the seed was that powerful, we'd throw it everywhere. It's the merging of the two that matter. And if the kingdom of peace is going to overtake a chaotic world, seed has got to be sown. Stop expecting the world to be Christian. They're not. They never will be if you don't scatter seed.
That's right. Amen.
Where are you in all this? The seed has to merge in order for life to be produced. The enemy knows that if the seed is allowed to even stay upon the hardened heart of an individual, it will eventually break through. So let's keep him busy.
Yeah.
Keep scattering it. Where are you? The soil reveals itself. If you've got ears, you need to listen. Question is, are you? Am I? So Jesus tonight, I confess I feel a little convicted. Because I've been a pretty good judge of soil. When you've called me to scatter seed. Oh, I'm an evangelist in title, but sometimes when I'm out in practice, I don't know. Can you do something in me? Or I just throw you everywhere I go? Can you do something in us here at the Church of the Nazarene? First Church, the other churches that are represented. Can you do something in us where we just throw Jesus everywhere we go, knowing that the seed has to merge with the soil and the seed is powerful? I believe more than ever our time is short. So help us in a chaotic world to spread your kingdom, a kingdom of peace. With your heads bowed, I invite you to stand to your feet, please, all over the sanctuary if you're able.